see an awful lot of dignitaries here. You know who you are. But no, Lou D'Alessandro is here. Mr. Spent 50 years in public service. I thought he was going to run one more term for the pension, but obviously he decided not to. So we just want to thank him for his public service and being here today. And this is our last event of the New England Council for the year. Senator, don't tell your colleagues in the delegation, but we saved the best for last. Okay?
Oh, somebody print that, will
okay? So, and I just want to thank, again, great friend BAE System for sponsoring this morning's breakfast, but they do so much good throughout the community. They're really a corporate giant here in the neighborhood of New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and they've done just a fantastic job with their employees, and they make sure that their employees get engaged in the community. Tom Bishop is almost like the ambassador for BAE here. But any worthy cause in New Hampshire, chances are BAE is one of the sponsors, and we thank them for all of the support that they do.
And Jim, if I could add to that, they're also significant in terms of protecting the national security of the United States, so thank you to BAE for that as well.
And as I said, this is our last event. We've had 55 events in all 6 New England states and in Washington this past year, and we thank all of you for the support that you've given to the New England Council. Needless to say, I don't think we have to say much about our guest speaker here today. We all know who she is and what she's done, but Senator Jeanne Shaheen is universally respected in the United States Senate on both sides of the aisle. And boy, do we need public officials like that who can really work across the aisle. She does that day in and day out, and we just admire her for that. We all know that she is now going to be given a very significant position, the ranking official in the Foreign Relations Committee. Also, I think it's the first time a woman would have that position. So
thank you.
And it's not just given just because she's a nice person, and she is, but she's competent, she's intelligent, she's articulate, and she is a tremendous advocate on very, very important issues. And I've watched the Senate committee hearings because, quite frankly, I have no life. I watch C-SPAN, and I've watched the senator, and I watch the respect that she gets from the other side of the aisle. And that's what we need in order to get things done. And we're grateful that the state of New Hampshire's chosen wisely and given her this platform. So with that,
thank you.
I've already been instructed, should love to have me ask a question or two, but it's more important that you have a chance to ask your question. So let me just quickly go through a couple and then give you an opportunity to think of your questions that you have for the Senator. So as we are about 1 week away from the end of the 118th Congress, is there anything that you think will get done? So,
actually, there are 2 things that we've got to get done in this week coming up. The first is the defense bill. The NDAA has to pass. It passed the House this week, and we're going to have our first vote on Monday when we get back, and hopefully pass it on Tuesday. And that's very good news because there's a lot in there that is important to New Hampshire, to the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, to our National Guard, to companies like BAE that are a critical part of the defense base in this state and in this country. So I think that will get done and get done with bipartisan support. The other thing we've got to do is pass a continuing resolution to keep the government funded. And I'm hopeful that that is also going to include an emergency supplemental bill to deal with disaster assistance. There are some important things in that bill to New Hampshire that we're hoping will stay in. The final negotiations haven't been done yet, but things like support for the Coast Guard. Some of you may know that the storms we had last year destroyed the boathouse for the Coast Guard, which has increased the times it takes them to respond. It's particularly significant as we think about their need to escort the submarines into the shipyard. So we're hoping that that funding will get in. There's funding to help the timber industry deal with something called the spruce budworm, which is affecting timber It's been a huge issue in Canada, and now it's flying down on currents in Maine, and it's headed our way. So if we can stop it, it will be important to the timber industry here. Obviously, there's a lot of help for the hurricanes that we saw in the south this fall, and in New Hampshire, there's help, we hope, for disaster funding to help farmers who last year lost almost all of their crops. If they were in the apple or stone crop industry, they lost almost everything. So we're hoping that that funding gets in there to help them as well.
You know, President-elect Trump has announced a number of cabinet appointees. Do any of them cause indigestion or controversy? Some of them will be in front of your committee. Have you made any comment about any of the nominees yet?
Obviously, there are some that I and others have expressed concerns about. There's a process that we're going to go through. I think it's important to let that process play out, to have a chance to ask questions, to see how people answer that process. I had the good fortune to meet with Senator Rubio, who's been nominated to be Secretary of State this week. We had a very good meeting. I've served with him on the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate since I got to the Senate, and I think he is very well qualified and is very thoughtful in how he's approaching the State Department and our foreign policy. So I think that was very positive.
You know, now you're assuming that significant position in foreign relations. Syria is hot on the front pages of the newspaper, and people are worried that Syria could become maybe another Afghanistan, or is this an opportunity for America to, one, remain with our troops there and maybe be, I don't know, of assistance to whatever the working government is? Your thoughts on what the U.S. role should be in Syria?
Yeah, you know, the bottom line here is that we don't yet know what's going to happen in Syria. Secretary Blinken and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan have been in the Middle East trying to meet to see if we can have a government in Syria. But there are a number of things that we do know that I think are important. First of all, the fall of Assad is a huge, huge victory for the people of Syria, who have suffered for 50 years under the Assad regime. We've watched, I'm sure if you've watched the news, you've seen the opening of the awful prisons that Assad had, the suffering, the torture, the killing of so many Syrians. You know, I was one of 10 in the Senate who voted to take action when Obama drew a red line in Syria back in 2013, I think that was. And I thought we should have acted then, and we didn't. And we've seen Syrians poisoned by by gas and chemical weapons by their own government. So I think most importantly, we should celebrate with the Syrian people that Assad is gone. Now, it's also a defeat for Vladimir Putin and Russia and for Iran, which is very good news for us. Now, how that plays out, we don't yet know. But we do know that Iran has lost its ability, at least for the time being, to traffic weapons across Syria to Hezbollah in Lebanon. And that is very good news. And we know that the 2 bases that Russia has in Syria are at risk. And again, that's good news for us if they are not allowed to reoccupy those bases and have that ability to operate out of Syria. So those are the positive things about it. There are some real concerns about the rebels who have taken control in Syria because they have previous links to al-Qaeda and to other terrorist groups, and that's a real concern. Now, so far, they have been pretty good about preventing attacks against civilians, about preventing looting of public buildings. We've seen some retribution killings it's not clear who those are being done by, whether it's the rebels or whether it's Syrians who are going after people who were responsible for some of the worst atrocities of the Assad regime. So the big concern I think we have is what happens with ISIS, which is still occupying parts of Syria. There's a significant part of the country that is still not controlled by anybody. And so what happens there, there's a huge humanitarian crisis in Syria that we need to worry about. So I think there are a lot of unknowns. We don't know yet what's going to happen. And I think it's important for us to continue to play a role. We have about 900 troops in Syria right now. And I think we need to make sure that they're protected, number one, but also that they can help provide some stability in the country just by being there.
Just one other area, that's Ukraine. We have a new administration coming in. They indicated that they may be able to work out a peace agreement very, very early in the administration. Do you see that likelihood occurring?
Well, President Zelensky has indicated that he might be open to a peace agreement. As you know, the Russians have made some gains recently, but it's a very challenging situation because it's, just hand-to-hand combat, attrition, thousands of people being wounded. On the Russian side, the estimates are that 750,000 people have been killed or wounded from Russia, and on the Ukrainian side, it's much less than that, but they have a smaller population. They have fewer people to send to the front who can fight, and they have been so courageous. So it's not clear. I think there are a couple of things that are important if we think about what needs to go into any negotiation. First of all, I think NATO membership needs to be on the table. I think if we take that off the table, we remove one of the biggest options to leverage the Russians that we have. So, and the fundamental issue there is that Syria needs to be assured that they are going to be secure in the future. What we don't want to see is a situation that allows Russia to do what they've done since they went into Crimea in 2014, which is to, they went into Georgia, the country of Georgia, in 2008. 6 years later, they took Crimea. Then they continued to fight in the eastern part of the country of Ukraine, and then they went in 2022 to attack in the whole country of Ukraine. So Ukraine wants to know if there is a peace agreement and there is some decision made about occupation of the eastern regions of Ukraine, that the rest of the country is going to be secure. So I think that's a really important piece. And again, I think what happened in Syria is helpful because it shows the weakness of Vladimir Putin. The fact that they weren't able to prop up Assad as they did the last time he got into trouble is significant. And also the fact that they've had to call on North Korea for troops to fight is not a sign of strength. I mean, it's a very troubling development in terms of the relationship between North Korea and Russia, but it sure doesn't show that Russia is strong. And despite the fact that their economy looks like it's doing okay right now, there's some significant impacts as the result of our sanctions. So this war has shown a couple of things for us. One is it's shown that Vladimir Putin and his army are not invincible. It's also been a wake-up call for us in the United States about the strength of our industrial base and our ability to respond in times of war. All of you who are involved in the defense industry know that one of the things that we've learned is that we haven't been able to respond as quickly as we would have liked in terms of some of the weapon systems that we wanted to provide to Ukraine. So it's been a wake-up call for us as well as for Europe and the rest of the world.
Questions from the audience now. And I noticed that Diana Griffin of AARP asked that she be allowed to ask a question. So go ahead.
Hi, Diana.
As you know, AARP is committed to ensuring that the social security system is financially strong and provides meaningful benefits now and in the future. Given the election results, What do you see as the likelihood of an entitlement commission or other actions that could threaten the program?
I think if there were a commission to take a look broadly at where we are with our national debt and expenses in the country, that would be a positive thing. I've actually sponsored legislation to do that. I think a commission that says it's going to cut Social Security or privatize Social Security is not a good thing. And one of the things we know as we're looking at what this new administration might do, they're talking about cutting $2 trillion, well, Elon Musk and the Doge group, an unfortunate acronym, but he's talking about cutting $2 trillion from the federal government. You can't cut $2 trillion without having a significant impact on some of the entitlement programs. And Social Security really is not an entitlement since everybody pays into it. You know, we have earned our Social Security. So I think there's reason to be concerned about what happens, and it's important that you all are here and that you're vigilant, because we need to be vigilant about that. There's also legislation that is being shopped around that would set up a separate fund to fund Social Security that would be guaranteed by the federal government. It sounds a lot like privatization, so it's not quite clear how that would work.
Other questions? Okay, Tom, we'll wait for the mic. Tom Samolak, John Hancock.
Senator Tom Samolak, John Hancock, you are the co-sponsor of a bill that would allow Medicare to pay for FDA-approved multi-cancer early detection testing. You were an early sponsor. We thank you for that. At John Hancock, we make that test available to customers, and it's been widely popular and effective. So the question is, in the continuing resolution, will there be a health component where there's a possibility that this wildly bipartisan bill could be included? Thank you.
I'm really hopeful that there's going to be some sort of a health component as part of the end-of-year funding package. It's not clear yet. Probably not likely that provision will be in it, sadly. I think it's more likely that some PBM reforms will be in there, and that there will be some extensions of some other health programs. I was also hoping that there would be an extension of the tax credits that are available to people under the Affordable Care Act, but it doesn't look like that's going to make it in either.
Thank you.
It's unfortunate.
I'm sorry. Did you think that the extension of the telehealth flexibility for Medicare?
I do think that will be in it. That's good news.
That's good.
I think we've all realized how helpful the telehealth provisions have been, and it's good for consumers, it's good for providers, and hopefully that will get in.
And you wrote a letter to leadership asking them to do that, so we thank you for that.
Along with a number of others.
Right, yeah, but you took a leadership role, and we appreciate that. Other questions of the senator? And yes, sir.
Since you're right here. Good morning. AJ Jarnigan, CEO of Expansion. We're a small business headquartered in Nashua, focused on our military and NASA. And thank you for what you mentioned about, my question is really about readiness for our military. Readiness is a broad topic, but when you think about mass and getting aircraft off the ground at an increased size and mass, a lot of aircraft, ships, subs, a lot of things are grounded because of simple things as parts availability, basic stuff, basically. We're focused very much on readiness and enabling advanced manufacturing, the adoption of all the digital practices that the DOE should get after. When you think about readiness challenges in all the hearings you're a part of, could you maybe highlight what are some of the key things as it relates to readiness that you feel are really holding us back in ensuring more availability of our military platforms? What are you seeing? What are you hearing? What can we all support and rally around specifically in this great state?
Well, that's a really important question. I was at the Reagan Forum, which is focused on national security this past weekend, and then a week or so before that, I was at a conference in Washington done by the Palace Foundation to talk about exactly that issue. And a lot of discussion was around procurement practices for the Department of Defense and how slow they are. And, you know, I have to blame Congress for part of that. I think it's not just DOD, it's also the regulatory requirements that Congress has put on. And one example that I gave was when the war in Ukraine broke out, the Secretary of Defense came to the Armed Services Committee and he said, will you give us multi-year procurement to address some of the equipment issues within the Department of Defense? And the objection immediately was from the Appropriations Committee, which I also sit on, but I'm going to blame them for saying, you know, because the Appropriations Committee wanted to maintain their control and not give it over to the Department of Defense. But when you're in a war or when you're trying to develop a wartime footing, you got to look at some of these things and provide more flexibility. And I think that's really important. And I think the focus right now on that procurement process, on what we can do better, is important. A big piece of that is shipbuilding. Right now, we don't have the capacity in the United States to build the ships that we need to build. And as we look at our competition from China, they are building ships at a very rapid rate, and we are not keeping up. And it's particularly, I'm very proud that here we have the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard that is doing a great job. You know, they're doing their maintenance work on time and on budget, but in terms of the shipbuilding, we're not keeping up with that.
Joe Donovan, just wait for the mic and then.
Senator, you touched on the role of NATO relative to negotiations with Ukraine. Can you share, given that the incoming administration has raised questions, particularly in the first term, on the role of NATO and the United States' commitment to NATO, on maybe what some of your colleagues on the other side are sharing with you on just the vitality, the importance of NATO to not just security in Europe, but around the world? Thanks.
Yeah, well, thank you for the question. I co-chair something called the Senate NATO Observer Group with Tom Tillis, who is a Republican from North Carolina. And we got restarted when we were expanding NATO again several years ago, and also when it was looking like it was threatened by the former Trump administration. And right now, I think NATO is stronger than it's ever been. One of the benefits, sadly, one of the byproducts, I should say it that way, of the war in Ukraine has been to strengthen NATO. The allies have come together, and we now have 32 member nations in NATO, now that we've added Finland and Sweden, which has been a huge benefit as we think about the Arctic and the northern part of Europe. And Congress has also passed legislation since then that says that a president can't take us out of NATO without congressional approval or without Senate approval. So that's also very positive. But I would add that I think President Trump had a point that he made very loudly. Other previous presidents had made it, but it's had some traction now, and that is that many of the NATO members were not paying their fair share of what they agreed to pay in terms of defense. There was an agreement that all countries in NATO should pay 2% of their gross domestic product on defense. And at the time that President Trump took office, I think only about 3% of the then NATO membership were paying. 3 countries were paying. Now, of the 32 NATO members, 23 are paying that 2% of GDP, and several are paying more than that. Poland is now paying the highest percentage of its GDP on defense. The Baltic countries are generally paying more than that. So it's had an impact that I think is positive, and we also have all the countries now in NATO who have a plan for how they're going to get to that 2%, and most of them have acknowledged that that's a floor, not a ceiling, that we need to be spending more than that. So I think that all of that is positive. The work that NATO's doing is very positive. There's a new Secretary General of NATO who has been down to Mar-a-Lago, who's met with President-elect Trump, and they seem to have a good relationship. So I think all of that is helpful. And NATO, I mean, make no mistake, I mean, the reason Putin hasn't gone into the rest of Eastern Europe is because of NATO. So it is, without a doubt, the strongest military alliance in history, and it has provided protection for the countries that are members in ways that I think we all take for granted. I know I do, but we need to appreciate the difference that it's made.
Sir, just get the mic. And then the young lady here.
First of all, thank you for doing this. Second of all, we recognize the complexity of dual path of what you're doing, running the government and representing the population of New Hampshire. I'm Bob Jackman. I'm with the American Building Materials Alliance, and our focus, and we don't want to lose the focus, is housing.
Absolutely.
Everybody in this room, everybody running for any office knows that it is one of the biggest problems we have. So how can we best, as an alliance, keep you informed of what the state of New Hampshire needs and what the constituents here need? What avenue is by far the best, and is there a silver bullet, so to speak?
Boy, it's hard to see where the silver bullet is, excuse me, but I'm really glad you raised the issue because, sorry, every business, every place I've been since COVID has had three major issues. Housing's number one, workforce, and childcare. And we are probably more challenged in the housing arena than our New England neighbors. We have, at least last year, we had the fourth tightest housing market in the country. In rental housing, a healthy rental housing market is about a 5% vacancy rate. Last year in New Hampshire, it was 0.6%. So we have a real challenge with housing. We get about $40 million from the federal government. Most of that is in the low-income housing tax credit. There are other programs that we get funding from. As you're probably aware, during COVID, there was funding that went to the state, and the state decided to put $100 million into a housing fund to try and provide more affordable housing. But it's a drop in the bucket, I gotta be honest, because we know we need, right now we have a shortage of about 23,000 housing units. That number increases in the out years. So thinking about how we can be more innovative in providing housing is really important. And we've got some good examples. In the Upper Valley, they have a fund that they've created with some of the largest businesses, and they are using that to fund housing development, affordable housing development, which is really exciting. And one of the things I like about that fund is that even though it's being supported by these large businesses, they said, we understand that housing is in everyone's interest. So we're going to put the money in without a guarantee that our employees are going to be the ones who get the housing. And I thought that was important because it recognized that this is a community responsibility and a community need. And it doesn't just go to one company or one neighborhood. There are some other really interesting choices that have been made in Dover. They have, we've got a company who has runs a nursing home there, and they couldn't get housing for their employees, so he's gone in and put up tiny homes for his employees, and they're really lovely. And I had a chance to go visit them, and he was telling me a story about an immigrant family who was coming in to work in the business, and when he was showing him the housing that he was going to have, the man looked at it and he said, "Is this just for my family?" Because he was so used to having such a housing crunch. So we've got some of those examples that are really exciting. There's a company in Rochester that's doing prefab housing in ways, 3D printing housing prefab. And Rochester has designated a certain amount of city land that they're going to put up a development using those 3D printed houses. But it's a continuing challenge, and it's something that we've got to think about. I don't have any magic answers for how we're going to do it, but I think we've got to support those efforts. And one of the concerns that I have about what President-elect Trump has talked about is the tariffs on Canada, because a lot of the lumber that we use in our housing market comes in from Canada, and that's going to increase costs at a time when we don't want to increase costs.
How do we keep you posted as to what our needs are? And I represent a company that builds modular homes, and we have a product specifically targeted at that.
Great.
We are one of hundreds. And how do we keep you informed as to what we need?
Sarah Holmes is my state director back there, and next to her is Allie Priest, who works with me. And you can talk to them or anybody on my staff, and it gets to me. I get a memo every week about everybody that the staff has met with and what their concerns are.
Okay. There's a young lady had a hand up. If we get the mic.
Thank you, Senator. Katie McQuaid from New Hampshire Community Loan Fund. You've been such a wonderful supporter for our efforts of preserving affordable home ownership through resident ownership of manufactured home parks.
Yes.
So thank you so much.
Thank you for the work that you do. It's
Thank
really
you.
impressive.
And I do think manufactured housing is one of the silver bullets that we can look for to solve our housing crisis. One of our concerns is you were a big supporter of the PRICE Act, which was going to help resident-owned communities improve their infrastructure. Oftentimes, when residents have the opportunity to buy their park and become owners, it comes with a lot of infrastructure issues. We have concerns that the PRICE Act money still hasn't flowed out and that it might not flow out in the new administration. Also, to that vein, all the GGRF funds. We're really excited to connect these families with low incomes with community solar. We've had a lot of success so far, and we're looking forward to those funds flowing down. What are the chances of all of those funds being clawed back in the new administration?
Well, anything that hasn't been obligated is going to be viewed as fair game. So I think we've got to be really vigilant in trying to ensure that that doesn't happen. I think the good news is that there are a lot of communities that are benefiting and are going to benefit from those programs, and so we need to make sure that people understand that. And we will be, please stay in touch with us. I know you do, and we will continue to do everything we can to fight for those. Thank you.
Other questions? Yes, sir. Mark, you want to get a mic to Mark?
To Mark? A mic to Mark?
That's the way that I say it. But see, I went to BC High, so that's a Dorchester accent.
Jim
right
has
there.
shown his
There it is.
his Boston accent.
My name is Mark Manuel. I own a small company in Amherst called Industrial Marketing. I was at Keene State College recently touring their Diamond Optical Lab. And we have quite an industry out in the western part of our state around photonics. And I learned that germanium is a very important material that China controls, and they're tariffing us, and they're putting limitations on it. And it got me thinking about, with your background, understanding the world, and especially Africa, do we have a national strategy about locating the materials that we need to make the stuff that's going to be able to be used in chips and just everything that's making us safe?
The answer is we have been way too slow to get a national strategy to deal with these critical minerals that are so important. Now, the Chips and Science Act that we passed 2 years ago, and that funding is already coming out under that, recognizes that and has taken some steps to address the semiconductor industry and what we need to do. But the raw materials, the critical minerals piece, we don't have the kind of strategy that we need, and it's, I think, a serious challenge. Now, there are efforts to look at that. There's some legislation that would address it that has not passed yet. But it's an ongoing issue that we really need to continue to focus on, and your voices are really important in saying this is an issue that we need to address.
The gentleman all the way in the back.
Hi, Matt. I know you can talk louder than that.
Matthew Hood from Dartmouth Health. Mark actually makes me think of a question I wanted to ask you and a thank you I wanted to give, which is thank you for your leadership with respect to the Baxter IV fluid situation and leading the delegation in that space and reaching out to Baxter. And my question related to Mark's is, do we have a strategy for supply chain on issues like this, like medical supplies, et cetera? Because we're encountering more shortages on a more consistent basis, unfortunately.
We are, and the IV fluid is a particular challenge because we only have, I think, 2 companies in the U.S. that make those IV fluids, and one is shut down because of the hurricane in North Carolina. So it is a challenge that's affecting our hospitals, as you know, at Dartmouth-Hitchcock. We do have a supply chain strategy to look at domestically producing a number of things, but it's really in its nascent stages, and so we have a lot of work to do there. It's one of the things that we've been talking to Region Valley and Army about, because they are working on a process that would allow like portable IV fluid stations to be set up all over, and they haven't yet been approved by the FDA. So we need to do more in that arena.
Other, yes, ma'am, Connor. Just wait.
I don't know if I'm going to get this all correct, but I'm Deb O'Brien from Community Resources for Justice. Here in New Hampshire, we have a federal reentry program and group homes for the developmentally disabled. We are a not-for-profit, so I was at a meeting in Massachusetts yesterday in which they were talking about HR 9495, Stop Terrorism Act, which allow the Treasury Secretary to strip the not-for-profit status of not-for-profits if they are considered to be funding terrorism in any way. And I wondered, we were talking about it, and I'm just wondering, they talked about it in relation to the Johnson Amendment, and I know the House passed that bill, and I'm wondering if you think the Senate will take it up?
Well, we're not going to take it up this year because we don't have time. I am not familiar with the legislation, but it's not going to come up between now and the end of the year. And what happens next year, it will have to be reintroduced. It would have to pass the House again and the Senate before it were enacted.
What was your reaction when FBI Director Christopher Wray announced his resignation?
Disappointed. I have served for the last longer than that, on the Commerce, Justice, and Science Appropriations Subcommittee, and we control funding for the FBI, and so Christopher Wray has been somebody that we've worked with over a number of years. I think he's done a very good job at the FBI, and I'm disappointed that he's leaving before his term is up, and I haven't had a chance to talk to the person who's going to be nominated as his successor, but I have serious concerns about what has been reported publicly about his statements of retribution and closing the FBI building on day one and making it a museum, some of the really outrageous things that he said.
Questions?
Right there.
I know Tom Brady feels this way all the time.
Tom Brady.
Sarah, do you want some water?
No, I've got some, thanks.
There's the mic.
Good morning. I'm Bob Coates from Eversource Energy. As you know, Eversource Energy is its energy delivery company here in New Hampshire and New England. We're very concerned about some of the things we're hearing out of the incoming administration around energy supply and diversity. We'd like to hear about your perspective on energy supply and diversity here in New Hampshire and New England.
Well, one of the things that was pointed out to me during the campaign was probably in October. I was at Revision Energy, which does solar panels, energy efficiency, and they pointed out that New Hampshire and Maine about 8 years ago were both getting about 1% of our energy from alternative sources. Now New Hampshire's getting 1.8% of our energy from alternative sources, and Maine's getting almost 12% of its energy from alternative sources. So it's clearly about what we're going to prioritize. I think there are a lot of reasons to be concerned about what's happening with energy, including the increasing costs, which I know you all are very concerned about. But one is the tariffs that are being talked about on Canadian imports will affect oil and gas coming into New Hampshire. We still are one of the highest states in the country in terms of number 2 fuel oil being the heating source for homes. And so that's a real problem for people if those costs go up. Also, there are a whole lot of other issues around that, as you know, because of our agreement, USMCA, and the agreement between Mexico, the U.S., and Canada, and what that would mean for that agreement. But that's one issue. Another issue is around what was called the Inflation Reduction Act that had a lot of provisions around energy that were helpful to states like New Hampshire that would have supported additional alternative sources of energy and energy efficiency. I've been a big supporter of energy efficiency because it's the cheapest, fastest way to deal with our energy needs. If we're not using energy, then it's not costing us anything. And there are provisions in there that help with building efficiency. So for you all who are working on homes, it would have helped with construction to help developers who are doing buildings with how to better make those energy efficient. That legislation is on the chopping block. There's some real concern about those provisions being rolled back and the help that's in there not being available to states. So I think there are a lot of reasons to be concerned about how our energy is going to be affected in the future here in New Hampshire and in New England. I mean, we know that we're at the end of the pipeline, so our energy costs are more expensive than most of the rest of the country.
Former Mayor of Manchester.
Hi, Bob.
Senator, welcome. Thank you for your outstanding service to the state of New Hampshire.
Thank you.
Just take the mic.
There's a mic behind you.
Oh, yep.
My question is about the Department of Education. The promise of the incoming president to get rid of the Department of Education. That pledge started with Ronald Reagan, I believe, when he ran. He was going to get rid of it. I'm back serving on the local school board, and we are very dependent on support from the Department of Education for everything from Title I to all the other funding. What are your thoughts on that? And what do you think of the chances of that happening are?
Well, the person who's been nominated to be Secretary of Education is Linda McMahon, who I had a chance to work with because I'm on the Small Business Committee when she was the SBA administrator in the first Trump administration. And Mike's nodding as a former employee of the SBA. But I found her to be very responsive, to be a good manager, to listen. And so I'm hopeful that all of that is a good sign as we're thinking about what happens at the Department of Education. I think those people who think we're going to get rid of it have no idea what they're talking about, to be frank, because it administers not just Title I, as you know. It administers Pell Grants, all kinds of programs that benefit people. And, I'm sure you share this. I'm tired of education being a whipping boy for everybody, for all the other challenges that people see. education is the most important place for us to invest in. Because, I mean, some of you who remember when I was governor and we focused on expanding kindergarten and supporting our schools, we are not going to compete with China, with India, with our European allies if we don't have an educated workforce, if we don't have an educated population, if we're not investing in science and technology and STEAM, the things that you've been focused on, engineering. And the way we do that is by making sure we have strong schools, that we have a strong system of higher education, that we give everybody who has the talent and the opportunity access to that system of education, that we have apprenticeships and all of the other education and training programs that we need for our workforce. And to say we're going to eliminate the Department of Education sends a message that we don't support and honor education. And that is a very bad message if we want to keep America the world leader that we have been.
Any other questions? If not, I'll just wrap up and maybe. Matt?
Hey, Senator Matthew Bartlett. You've been, such a bipartisan leader, a true leader. And then when it comes to the New Hampshire primary, I know you were a pit bull, a dog, always fighting to make sure that we go.
I like that image, pit bull.
Pit bull.
Well, it's true. First in the nation. Obviously, those questions remain. It's always going to be a fight. Do you think we should go first? And what does that process look like? Thank you.
Absolutely, we should go first. And I think the Democratic Party nationally, as I've said, made a mistake in demoting New Hampshire and putting South Carolina first. I think because we have been doing the first presidential primary for over 100 years now, we have people who are engaged. I mean, you talk to any reporter who's covered the presidential selection process, and they will tell you that in New Hampshire, voters are more engaged than in any other place in the country. That we go see multiple candidates, we wait to make our decision, we ask hard questions. I remember talking to Elizabeth Warren at one point when she was running for president, and she was telling me she got asked about some arcane PFAS provision when she was in New Hampshire. And she said, I never thought I'd get asked questions like that. I said, oh yeah, well, that's New Hampshire, only in New Hampshire. So I think it's been important to the presidential selection process. I think it's important for us. I think it's going to continue because reporters like it, candidates like it. We're already seeing on the Democratic side lots of potential presidential candidates coming to New Hampshire to engage with us. So I'm going to do everything I can to make sure we get it back.
Are there any rising stars on the Democratic Party that you're looking at?
Oh, lots of rising stars, Jim. Come on.
Just thought I'd give you an opportunity to single out someone. The Senate leadership is going to change. You have a new majority leader, John Thune. Your thoughts on how you think he's going to conduct the chamber?
John Thune, I'm not on any committees with John, and so I don't know him very well, but he is an institutionalist when it comes to the Senate, and I think that's a good thing. They've put out a calendar that says we're going to be working a lot more days in the coming year. I think that's a good thing, actually. And I'm hopeful that we're going to get back to a process that allows us to legislate, which has been a real frustration on the part of a lot of people in the Senate, that we spend all our time working on nominations and we don't actually get legislation to the floor. We aren't able to amend it when we get it to the floor. And I think that's a real problem. I think we've got to get back to legislating.
And filibuster, is that an issue that's behind us now, or is that still going to be a topic of concern to some of your colleagues, that we maybe want to fine-tune it to make it a little easier to move legislation?
I don't think it's clear how that's going to play out.
Okay. And then the other question I had is the tax cut of 2017. It seems to be on the fast track of the first 100 days of John Thune's leadership in the Senate and the President-elect, is to have them not only extended but to be made permanent. Some people are concerned that it's going to increase the debt that we already have, 36 trillion, maybe by 6-7 trillion additional.
Right.
Your thoughts on how this is going to play out?
Yeah, we have a process in the Senate called reconciliation that a lot of you probably know what that is, but it allows you basically, assuming that the parliamentarian says the provisions in the legislation are appropriate, it allows you to bypass the 60 vote requirement under the filibuster. We're hearing that there are going to be 2 reconciliation packages in the new year, that the first one will not be an extension of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act from 2017, that it will be focused on border security and on some other things. We're hearing that the tax package will come after that. It's not clear if that'll be in the first quarter or the second quarter, and that the effort is to figure out what worked during the first reconciliation package and then apply those lessons to the second. I have real concerns about the extension of that tax bill from 2017 because of the cost. Estimates are at the low end 4 trillion added to the deficit, at the high end 10 trillion, depending on what gets put into it. And while I think we would all like the middle class tax cuts that are in there, the fact is most of the tax cuts are going to the wealthiest 1%, who I don't think need more tax cuts. And it will just increase the disparity between lower and middle income voters and the highest 1% of voters. So I think it's unfortunate that that's what is being proposed, and I think it's going to be very difficult. I expect it to pass, but the question will be, how much is it going to cost? Is it going to add 10 trillion to the deficit, or is it going to add 4 trillion? And we're getting into a space where you're not going to be able to pay for that because you're not going to be able to get cuts, which is what Elon Musk and company want to do to cover it. And the only way you're going to pay for it is by making cuts to programs like Social Security, Medicare. They're talking about dramatically reducing Medicaid, which is a concern for us in New Hampshire because we have so many people who get their health care through Medicaid, and actually that's true nationwide. So I think there's real reason to be very concerned about what's being proposed and the impact that it will have on everybody because of the cost. You know, if you look at right now, the interest on the national debt is of almost $900 billion a year. That's more than we spend at the federal level for anything, including defense, except for Medicare and Social Security. So we're talking about adding a significant amount to the national debt that's going to cost all of us. You know, it's going to cost us and it's going to cost our children and grandchildren. And I think that's not tenable. And it's important for us to make our concerns known that we don't think this is the right approach.
Well, with that, I think you'd all agree it's been a very informative, enlightening discussion with our senior senator here, and
it's not a good way to end before the holidays. We should end on a happy note, Jim. Come on.
Well, give the mic to Mark again. It is amazing, though, sitting here and just listening to the senator. She can answer any question on any issue. She is really well versed. And these questions just came out of the blue. It's not like, hey, we kind of rehearsed. It just tells you how up she is on every issue and how it impacts her state here and our nation. So, boy, are we grateful that we have her as a champion and advocate in the United States Senate. So with that, thank you. Happy holidays.
Thank you. Yes, happy holidays, everybody. Thank you all.